Good evening and welcome to the Gates-Chili Central School District's budget hearing and meet the Board of Education candidates night. I'm Dr. Mitch Ball, the Assistant Superintendent for Business. Thank you for being here. We're going to start with a Pledge of Allegiance, so could you please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So before I begin the first portion of the evening, the budget hearing, I wanted to share that Mr. Daly, Superintendent of Schools, is unable to attend due to a family emergency. He wishes the candidates who will participate in the second half of the evening good luck, and he truly wishes that he could have been here tonight. So thank you for that. So at this point, we're going to start the budget hearing. If this will work. Maybe. There we go. So this is the agenda for tonight. We're going to talk about budget goals and priorities, the state of the state, expenditures, revenues, propositions, what our next steps are, then a summary, and then any public question and answer that you may have. So budget goals and priorities, what are we trying to accomplish in this budget? So we're trying to maintain our current programming and staffing and continue with the district goals. We acknowledge that the goals that we do have in place are very important to the work that we do, as are our staff and programming. And so a large portion of our budget is tied to our staffing. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, but want to say that this is really our first and primary goal in this budget cycle. In addition, use our state and federal funding to maintain intervention and mental health supports. We do know that as a result of the pandemic, we've identified some student needs in terms of AIS, for instance, math and reading, mental health needs with our students, and we do acknowledge that those are important to the district and important to our community, and want to make sure that we continue to support those into next year. And we want to continue to provide multiple opportunities for student engagement. So one thing that we do know to be true is that things like athletics and extracurriculars are really important to the programming that we do have in place here in Gates-Chili, because we know that when students are participating in other activities, it keeps them engaged in the programming and helps them achieve at greater rates than individuals who are not involved and engaged. So we really try and make sure to continue to engage them in our programming. So state of the state, I had this on the presentation up until about an hour and a half ago. We did not have a state budget, and so we now have a state budget, and that is good news for us. So the state budget aligns very closely with what was in the initial proposal that was approved by the Board of Education a few weeks ago. And so at this time, we don't anticipate that it's going to have any market increase or change in terms of how we're budgeting our monies going into next year. So the good news is the state in those final budget runs did not withhold any additional monies from the district and did not substantially increase any of our anticipated state aid. So there is no budgetary gap. We are using fund balance and reserves to cover the budget, and I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail on some upcoming slides. The current proposal is $128 million, a little over $128 million, and the percentage is 5.08% increase over the prior year. One thing that I did want to share is that when looking at the region, this is something that we've shared with the Board of Education, we're seeing increases anywhere from 4.75 to 9.39. Tied very closely to significant increase in cost, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So for Gates-Chili, a 5.08% increase is what's in the budget proposal. From an expenditure perspective, we use a modified zero-based methodology for budgeting, and what does that mean? That means that for most of our budget lines that we have control over, we start at zero, and then we build a budget off of those. So we have a very lengthy process that starts back in October and includes staff members across all of our buildings and departments. They put in budget proposals to their principals, their directors, From there, the principals and directors vet those, and then we have a lot of conversation about how do the proposed expenditures align to our budget goals and priorities. And so in terms of building that budget, it is a modified zero-based. We do look very closely at all of our budget lines. It is a no-frills budget, and again, the percentage increase. So some highlighted increased costs. This is an important slide we like to share. What it highlights is what are those things that are driving our budgetary increase. And so in aggregate on this slide, you'll see $6.9 million in increased costs. ERS salaries, that's our salaries that are tied to our support staff that are typically in the employee retirement system. We're seeing a significant increase in that area because, as you know, wages are on the rise. When you look in the public sector, you see pretty high rates for employees who are in those types of jobs, and so now we're competing with those employers. And we're also having to deal with increases in minimum wage. We've seen those increases continue to happen, and so as those things happen, we have to adjust accordingly. In the past, school districts, we would pay anywhere from $1.50 to $2 more of the lowest paid workers in the public sector, and now the private sector, and now we're in a scenario where we can't keep up, and so we're continually increasing wages, and that's a significant driver for our budget. Another one is operations and maintenance. So our energy costs are anticipated to be significantly higher than they have been in the past. As you know, probably with your home budgets, those energy costs are on the rise, and so when thinking about operations and maintenance, $1.5 million increase in how we budget for keeping the lights on and heating buildings. Security, so one thing that we knew to be a priority going into next year was, or actually we started it this year, is increasing security staff, and we're going to need to plan to fund for that going into next year. So we added 2 security staff members that are shared between our 2 elementary buildings. So one is shared between Walt Disney and Neil Armstrong, and one is shared between Paul Road and Florence Brasser. So we know what's going on out in the world, and we want to make sure that we're continuing to protect our students and staff. Pension cost, teacher retirement system. So for the teacher retirement system and the employee retirement system, the district has to pay a portion of salaries into that system every year. That is one of the ways that the pension system funds itself. And so we pay 10.5% of our teacher salaries. That increase is tied directly to that. And then health insurance. We all know that although we're in a consortium where we collectively purchase health insurance, and that's one way that we keep costs in check, and we do feel that we continue to beat the private sector in terms of percentage increases, we still have to acknowledge that there's increases in health insurance every year. And so that first portion is the active employee increase, and the second portion is we have over 600 retirees in the district, and per their negotiated contracts that they had upon retirement, we fund a portion of their health insurance depending on what contract they retired under. So there are some increases in that area as well. And finally, transportation services. We've seen increased costs in buses and fuel, obviously in heating and taking care of that building. So there is a significant increase in that area as well. Again, total $6.9 million, which is one of our, which these things are some of our major budget drivers. So one of the things that we have to do under state legislation is break our budget into 3 parts, the administrative, instructional or program component, and the capital component. And so as you'll see up on this slide, it's fairly consistent with prior year, and this is generally consistent with what you would see across most school districts in New York State. So there's a number of budget lines here. This is the instructional component, a $2.8 million increase. As you can see there from all of that information, I'm not going to go line by line, but maybe give everybody a minute to take a look at that before I proceed to the next. What happens a lot of times in terms of instructional salaries is people move between buildings, and so we have to shift salaries accordingly. And again, this is the major part of our budget, is the instructional and program component. The next component is the administrative component, a $1.6 million increase. One of the main increases in this area, without it the percentage would be a 9% increase, is that we had to recode a portion of the budget out of the instructional component into the central administration component, just based on some coding requirements under state regulations. So if you can look at that central services line, the $530,000, that is tied directly to moving from a separate budget code, which was 2630. Okay, and finally the capital component. As you can see, a slight decrease in debt service, but central services is up significantly. We have, again, additional energy costs, and also the security personnel are in that budget as well. When thinking about our budget on a per dollar basis, most of our budget is spent on salaries and benefits for employees. We're a people business, and so obviously this is where we focus most of our energy in terms of how we fund the budget. From there is BOCES services. We do work very closely with BOCES on a number of programs and services, and for the most part, when we contract with BOCES, this isn't just for students, but this is for services as well. We get a percentage back on that in state aid in the following year. Our general BOCES aid is 74 cents, which means we get 74 cents back on the dollar. And then for some other costs, there's a much more robust calculation in order to figure out how much aid we'll get back. And additionally, we spend some money on debt service. That's another big driver. Debt service is our principal and interest payments on the money we borrow to do work. For instance, this professional learning center, we did some work in here, and that was part of the $68 million capital project. Although we used some reserve funds to help balance the cost of that budget, we do have to take out debt service, which is like a mortgage payment, principal and interest payments, to fund capital construction. And so those are the types of things that funds. And then you get down into smaller items. One thing I really like to share about this per dollar breakdown is that many of our expenses are not easily reduced. In order to reduce school budgets, generally speaking, most of our money is tied up in personnel. And so in order to reduce budgets, we would have to make some programming and servicing decisions. And so those are hard decisions to make. So it's not as easy. As you can see, materials, supplies, and books is only 4% of our budget. It's not a huge budget driver in how we fund our budget. So revenues. Local property tax, we're assuming the cap. Local sales tax is fairly stable. State funding is increasing, and then other revenues are consistent. So local property tax accounts for nearly 47% of all revenues. In order to calculate the tax cap or the tax levy limit calculation, there's a number of factors that go into that. So the legislation, sometimes you'll hear that people make a comment that it's 2% is all we can tax. That's not really how the calculation works. 2% is the limit of the base. And so beyond 2%, there's other things called exclusions that help drive that number up or down. In terms of, so for instance, last year when 2021 CPI was around 1.6%, our base was 1.6. Anytime it's over 2%, so in 2022 it was 8%, that means that our calculation is dropped down to 2%. So we start at 2% and then we're able to build things into the calculation. One of those being tax-based growth factor, which the state looks at how much the tax base has grown and you're able to add a percentage for that. Another one is capital exclusion. So Again, if that capital exclusion number goes up, which is a balance of those debt service principal and interest payments and state aid, if that goes up, that can drive our cap up a little bit. And the reason why the state says it can do that is because the public approves a capital project and acknowledges during that process that there may be a slight increase in taxes tied to that capital project. Another one is pilots, payments in lieu of taxes. These are negotiated tax agreements between Imagine Monroe and the particular entity. Imagine Monroe is also known as COMITA, and so that agency negotiates with businesses or organizations in the community to attract them to communities, to get them to build and create jobs in communities. And as a result of that negotiation or that way of drawing them in, they get a form of tax abatement through these payments in lieu of taxes. And so that's one thing that we use in determining the tax levy limit calculation. So the current levy, $58 million, the estimated 23-24 tax levy, $59.9 million, or a $1.7 million increase, which equates to $2.99, with an estimated true value tax rate of 24.25, noting very importantly that this is tied to 2022 equalization rates and assessments. So as you know, Challenge Day is May 15th, and so there may still be some challenges that come out in terms of people's assessments, and equalization rates may change, so that may impact the actual tax rate as we get closer to August, September, and tax season. So local sales tax, again, some uncertainty around various pieces of legislation, how sales tax with Amazon is going to shake out. Again, we keep a pretty close pulse on this. Over the course of this year, we have seen some increased some sales tax revenue, which is good news. Going into next year, we don't know what the market's going to do, so we're trying to be fairly conservative in terms of that budget. State funding accounts for 43% of our revenue. Foundation aid, which is the general formula that school districts receive aid on. That formula looks at a whole number of demographics and facts relating to the district, from student enrollment to student need. Our combined wealth ratio, which is an index of property wealth and income wealth, a lot of things that that foundation aid formula looks at. And that formula is our basic formula-driven aid. And so essentially what the state does is they say they're going to allocate a certain amount of money to foundation aid. They put it into a formula that then distributes it to nearly 700 districts across New York State. And so over the last 15 years, the state hasn't fully funded that formula. And for instance, here in Gates Chili, over that 15 years, the state has withheld over $100 million in guaranteed aid through the formula, which is a legislated formula. The good news is that the state in this coming fiscal year has promised to fully fund that formula, which is what this, the majority of that increase is tied to, is fully funding the foundation aid formula. And then some categorical or expense-based aids. Those are things like that BOCES aid I was talking about, transportation aid. We get 75 cents back on the dollar for our transportation expenses, and building aid. When we do capital construction, we get aid back from the state at over 80 cents on the dollar for that work. So again, here's the state funding breakdown as indicated in our budget proposal. And again, the major driver is that foundation aid. Other revenue accounts for 1.2% of all revenues. There's a number of things in there, from tuition fees, interest earnings, sale of property, and Medicaid reimbursement. We don't have a lot of levers like the private sector does to make money. We're not a business, so we can't sell goods and increase prices. So this smaller area is not very flexible in terms of what we can do with it. It's pretty stable from year to year. And then there's appropriated fund balance and reserves. We're trying to reduce our reliance on this. A few years ago, we were up near 5%. We've been slowly trying to reduce our reliance on it because we do know over the next couple of years that both federal funding will be reduced. The pandemic aid that we've received over the last few years is no longer going to be available. And in addition to that, we know that once that foundation aid formula is fully funded, we're going to go back to seeing the traditional increases of anywhere from 1 to 4% in foundation aid. This year we received a much higher percentage because they're fully funding the formula, which means that there's some catch-up in terms of how much money we're going to get through that foundation aid. So we're trying to reduce our reliance on reserves and fund balance right now, acknowledging that we may need some of those exhaustible funds to help us balance our program, balance our budget, and continue to provide the strong programming we do for our community. That's fund balance. Again, appropriated fund balance is money we carry over from the prior year into the next year to help balance the budget. So we're looking to carry over this year, from this year's budget, into next year, $1.1 million to help balance the budget. And again, we're trying to maintain under 4%. As you can see, last year we were at 4.62%. That's down in the utilization data. It's the second line from the top. Next year, looking at 2.84% utilization. Revenue budget breakdown. This is typical of most districts across New York State. Most money is property taxes and state aid, anywhere from 80 or 70%-ish to about 95% of school budgets are in these two categories, and then those smaller items down below. So this is an overall revenue snapshot. Again, our revenue proposal ties directly to our expenditure proposal. School budgets are required to have a balanced budget proposal, which means we're assuming, again, a budget is a plan for next year for many months out from now. We're assuming that our expenditures and our revenues will match. So that's it for the budget portion. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about propositions. 4 propositions on the ballot this year. One is the expenditure budget. The next one is bus purchases. We have a 6-year bus replacement schedule. We've determined that that is in terms of both safety for students and in terms of cost to the district. That is the most prudent bus replacement schedule, 6 years. That's the point at which the trade-in value and the cost to maintain a bus outstrips the cost of purchasing a new bus. And so we are on a 6-year bus replacement schedule. Last year we did 15 buses, and the prior year we did 15 buses. We're looking at 14 this year because costs have gone up significantly, especially in terms of where the steel market's at. So we're trying to trim that down by 1 bus going into next year to help keep that approximate amount that we spend on buses stable. The next one is a capital reserve creation of $15 million. One of the things that the district has to do under state regulations is have a 5-year building condition survey where we go through all of our facilities and grounds and look at the condition of them. We had to do that a few years ago, and there are a number of things that the district hopes to address. And in order to address that, we would like to save up some money in a reserve so that we don't have to increase taxes with a future capital project proposal. And then the last one is a student ex officio representative to the Board of Education. I know a number of districts have these types of positions. Essentially what this position is it's a student representative to the board. They would sit at the board table. They don't have any voting power in terms of making decisions, but they do have a voice at the table when decisions are being made. And a lot of times they'll also share a report as well as to what's going on with students in the district. So that would be a high school senior, and according to the legislation, we have to have the public approve that student ex officio board member. So next steps, the budget vote and elections are on May 16th. We do look at some data during the day of the budget vote, and we noted that last year we had the budget vote from 6 to 8 p.m., 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. We didn't have anybody come in between 6 and 6:30, but towards 8 p.m. we started to have a whole lot of people who were looking to vote, And so we're shifted the vote time to 6:30 and ending at 8:30 so that we can be sure to accommodate all of our community members. That vote will be held in the field house, as has been the case for the last couple of years. If you're looking for more information about the budget, please go to gateschi.org/vote. In summary, our intention is to maintain our current programming and staffing, again, use those state and federal fundings to increase supports, continue to provide multiple opportunities for student engagement, while acknowledging that this is a balanced budget and we are using some exhaustible reserves and fund balance to make it balanced. If you are looking for more information, more detailed information, you can go to gateschi.org/bit of budget. That's a bit of budget with Dr. Ball. It's very interesting and informative. A shameless plug. Thank you very much. At this point, are there any public questions, comments, answers? Yes? Yes, it's a security guard. At this time, we just, based on our rotation, we found that that was the most prudent thing to do. They have a presence in both buildings. It's not, from a scheduling perspective, it's not that they're at certain places at different times. They have a rotating schedule and they shift through and help building principals as needed. And again, adding these additional staff members, one of the primary drivers was requests from those building principals to have a presence at times in those buildings. Yes? Correct. So again, and sorry for those listening on the live stream, the question was about the security staff and a question about whether or not we should be having those, a full-time person in every building. And again, just acknowledging what the needs are currently in those buildings, it was generally agreed that a shared person between those two buildings was most prudent. Yes?
Follow-up question about the security question. How was the need identified to increase security at the buildings?
So the need was identified. So the question was, how was the need identified to increase security at the buildings? The response is that this year, the district established a safety and security task force that includes a representative from every building, the security lead, the director of facilities, the SRO, Erica Despard through the Gates PD, along with the director of phys ed, myself, and I think a few others. Those are the ones I can think of at this time. That task force was established to look at all of our internal safety and security protocol and make recommendations on how we could increase some presence. That was one of the things that we talked about. So that recommendation came through that task force. And at the end of the school year here coming up, the plan is to give a report to the Board of Education on the work that that task force has done. Any other questions? Okay. So with that, thank you for being here tonight. We're going to take a brief pause now. The live stream for the public hearing will end in a moment, and we will transition over to the next event, which is Meet the Candidates Night. The evening will be hosted by Monroe County School Boards Association Executive Director Amy Thomas. As a former Board of Education member, Ms. Thomas has a deep knowledge of and commitment to the work of public education, including school board governance. We thank you for your patience as we transition both our setup here in person and our virtual live presence. So that virtual stream will end, and we will open back up with Meet the Candidates Night. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.